We will be recording this. So my name is Monica McCoubry. I am the Wildlife Education Specialist for the Nebraska Game and Parks Commission. And I'm going to go ahead and just kind of go through this first slide here, and then I will hand it over to Ted and Grace.
Sorry, I'm trying to get it. There we go.
There we go. Thanks, Grace. So really quick, I don't think we'll have any problems today, but just letting everybody know, if you do have any questions or comments, please go ahead and put them in the chat. If you've never used the chat before, it's a little kind of bubble looking thing at the very bottom of your screen. You can type in a comment or a question if you have one. We will probably not answer questions until maybe the very end. So if you don't want to forget, go ahead and put it in the chat, but we will get to them as soon as we can. Just make sure keeping everything clean and nice and just be appropriate. I'm sure we won't have a problem. All right. I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Ted and Grace.
All right. Thank you, Monica. My name's Ted LaGrange. I'm the Wetland Program Manager in our Wildlife Division with Nebraska Game and Parks Commission and cover the entire state of Nebraska working on wetlands. And hand it over to Grace.
Yes. Hello, I am Grace Gard, and I am the Aquatic Ecology Education Specialist. So within the Game and Parks, we have an education division. So that's where I work, and get to work with Ted on a bunch of cool projects as well, which we'll touch on later. So as we get going, we're just going to tell you a little bit about what today looks like in this presentation. And so we're going to go through a series of kind of topics as we go. So we have, what is a wetland? What do wetlands do? Like, why are they important to us? Losses and threats to wetlands, the various Nebraskan wetland complexes that we have, different ways we categorize them, their dynamic nature, conservation initiatives associated with wetlands, and then the awesome recreational opportunities that wetlands offer us. So I'm going to kind of get us started with some of the basics in regards to wetlands, and then Ted will take us through some of the more in-depth aspects of different wetland types and their threats. So to get us going, what is a wetland anyway? So a wetland is going to be an area that is saturated or full of water, which this water can be surface water or it can be groundwater. And that water will be there present often enough and for long enough that it can support specific plants, and those plants would be adapted to soggy soils. So wetlands can include swamps, marshes, bogs, there's fens. There's a lot of actually really unique pieces of wetlands, and just kind of how they exist can be pretty varied. So we'll talk about some of those today. And so when we think about what wetlands are, I like to kind of split it up into three things. So the first piece, essential piece of wetlands is their soil. So their soil is going to be what we call hydric, and that just basically means it's going to be full of water. And remember, this isn't all the time, but most of the time these types of soils are going to have water or be hydric. They will also typically develop, so soil, if you know about decomposition and things breaking down, that's usually how we get soil in the first place, is natural materials breaking down and their energy breaking down into soil. But typically wetland soils will develop in areas that are underwater with little to no oxygen. So a lot of times these soils, and there's a few pictures there you can kind of see, and we will have some really amazing photos in here in this presentation from Platte Basin time lapse, so you'll see those throughout. But the different kinds of soil, especially wetland soil, will have kind of be gray in color or darker black, and tend to even smell kind of like rotten eggs. And then it's going to contain a lot of organic matter, and organic matter is essentially just, you know, bits of things that have died, like decaying leaves, and maybe an animal or fish that died in the water. So all those things kind of make up what organic matter is. The second piece of what a wetland is their plant community. So there are going to be specific species that are adapted to live and reproduce in anaerobic conditions. And anaerobic just means there's a lack of oxygen there. So there's not going to be very much air, and not all plants can survive with that. So if you know much about plants, they do need oxygen to be in the soil, at least certain ones that are terrestrial do. So wetland plants are unique because they can kind of function like that without oxygen in that soil. So you've got cattails in that first photo. There's and those kind of stand on the edges of bodies of water. You've got things like American lotus, which will actually float out in maybe semi-deep water, but not super deep. And then you've got smartweed, which is a annual plant. It kind of reseeds itself and will come back the next year too. And so those different kinds of plants, they might be submerged, and they can even kind of create more of themselves through their roots. So they kind of have unique processes the plant communities do that exist in wetlands. And then the third piece is just the hydrology, which is having to do with the water that is in wetlands. So they're going to be saturated, especially during the growing season. So for us in Nebraska, that's spring and summer. And from those photos, you can just kind of see wetlands are not always going to be wet. And Ted will talk about that more later about the dynamics of wetlands, but you can see like even that wetland in the lower left, it's growing season, but you can just tell that there's water there, but you can't necessarily see standing water. So wetlands don't always look the same way too. They're going to be changing a lot, but that hydrology piece is usually present for some part of the year. So those are the three things: the soil, plant community, and hydrology are what make up our wetlands. And then we like to talk about what do wetlands do, or how do they function. So one of the big things is they can absorb water like a sponge. And we like to think about maybe ecosystem services. If you haven't heard this word before, it's basically the benefits that nature can provide to humans. Whether that's, if we have big runoff events and flooding, a lot of time wetlands can help absorb that water. And you can see this is a close-up of some soil, and we see that dry, cracked soil, and sometimes we think that might be a bad thing, but really that's like the spaces and the pores in the soil are really open at this point. Same with like a dry sponge. And then if you add water to that, it's going to absorb right into that soil and be able to hold a lot of that water. So wetlands are also kind of like a buffer. They can absorb different things as water passes through them. So this next photo, Ted, feel free to add anything here if you want, but this photo, I know it's an older photo, but you can kind of see in the bottom right, that's right, Ted, where the water is coming into this wetland. You can go ahead and elaborate if you want.
Yeah, a friend of mine took this in a wetland after a heavy rain event. And so yeah, the lower right, that chocolate milk colored water coming in is coming off some ag fields. And so it's full of sediment or silt erosion from the crop fields, and is carrying along with it some nutrients and chemicals. And then as it passes through this fairly large wetland with a lot of vegetation, the water actually gets cleaner, and the water actually exits the wetland at the top of the picture. And the water there is quite clean that's coming out of this wetland. So, and that sponge and filter effect that the wetlands can provide.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, so improving water quality is a really big piece of what wetlands can do. And that helps us as humans and also helps the things that live there. I know our fisheries biologists, that's a big thing that, if they're managing a lake, they think about these things too, like where could a wetland be to help improve habitat quality. So the ability to filter out sediment or pollution is a really big piece of what wetlands can do. They also produce food and fiber. So obviously a big part of Nebraska's culture is farming and ranching. And so wet meadows actually can be a place where you can definitely grow hay and you can hay those fields. I think they've adapted some cool machinery to be able to do that even when the field is wet. So producing that food for maybe cattle or whatever it might be. And then as you can see, lots of ranchers can use those wetlands to graze their animals on. And that can be really beneficial for kind of everyone because it gives good nutrition to the animal and then kind of is less effort in a way for the farmer to have to feed them. So Those are some aspects of what wetlands can do. And they also provide habitat for fish, wildlife, and plants. So you can see along here, I've got kind of some different categories, and I realize I don't have fish on there. I'm very sorry. I need to figure out what those numbers are. But wetlands are the most productive natural system in Nebraska, which is really cool to think about. So to help you kind of visualize that, when you think about plants, 50% of the plants in Nebraska are going to be found in or around wetlands. 100% of Nebraska's amphibians do rely on wetlands to survive. So we really need those for all of our amphibians. They obviously use them heavily. Then you've got different kinds of reptiles, and this can include snakes as well as turtles. 38% of all of our reptiles in Nebraska use wetlands. As far as birds go, that's pretty large as well. 50% of our bird species will use wetlands. And sometimes that's like they stay there often, or maybe they're passing through and migrating through. So, and then mammals category also, there are going to be a lot of mammals that you find in wetlands. So 36% of Nebraska's mammals depend on wetlands. So I'm just going to show you a few of what this might look like. So I love this photo. It's a common snapping turtle who has definitely been in a wetland. And so he's covered in that mud there. So you'll find those. You might find this guy in the water. This is a salamander larva. So this is when they've got those gills on them still, and they're living mainly underwater. And then you might also see different kinds of leopard frogs and the Cope's gray tree frog. So a lot of our amphibians especially heavily rely on our wetlands. Then there's going to be a lot of bird diversity. I definitely didn't even scratch the surface of birds here on this slide, but that upper left is an osprey. They heavily depend on fish for their diet. So they're a raptor, they'll eat meat mainly. And then you've got things like the blue-winged teal, lesser yellowlegs, yellow-headed blackbird, I believe, and then green heron, killdeer. There are so many more. You know, some of them dabble in the shallows and will eat plants of vegetation. Then you've got some of those with taller legs that, you know, wade through the shore, and they're gonna, you know, spear fish or be hunting fish in the shallows, or small invertebrates. And they tend to nest in these places as well, whether they use it as stopover habitat or they stay there all summer. Then we have mammals. I really like this photo too. We've got a badger. I believe this is in the saline wetland. So this could be close to Lincoln, actually, where this photo was taken. And so badgers can be found there, and white-tailed deer, which are our state mammal. You've got muskrats, skunks, beavers. So there's a lot of different types of mammals that use these, even more than what I've put on here, but they depend on them kind of in different ways, but especially, you know, beavers and muskrats will certainly use them heavily. And then fish are obviously very important. And again, I didn't cover necessarily all the fish that would use a wetland, but you've got bluegill are very common. They can survive in lots of wetland habitats. Gar and burbot, that kind of stripy one that's orangish is a burbot. They will kind of use, they can actually use the air and use it kind of like a lung in really brackish or like water that's not the nicest water to live in. They can survive pretty well in those. So wetlands are great places to find, yeah, largemouth bass, maybe a pike, sunfish. So lots of different fish species, way more than what I'm showing here. And especially the biggest category that's like a huge foundation for lots of the animals that live in a wetland is these invertebrates. So this picture shows a water boatman. They're very kind of cool. They zip through the water. They're called what we call maybe a macro invertebrate because you can see it without a microscope. So they're big enough to see with just your eyes. And then you know, on the water edges, you're gonna find spiders. In certain nice wetland habitats, you will find mussels in that photo, and then damselflies, but there are so many other types of invertebrates that are not even covered here. So again, wetlands are very important places for you to find all kinds of different plants and animals. Actually, 75% of our threatened and endangered species do rely on wetlands. So we've got the Salt Creek tiger beetle in there, the whooping crane, and the saltwort plant. So those are just a few, but like I said, 75% is quite a bit. And then another function, we go back to functions of wetlands, is recreation, but we're actually going to cover this more towards the end. And I might go ahead and let Ted, I'll stop sharing my screen here real fast. And then Ted's going to take us through some more awesome things about wetlands.
Great.
One quick question that I do see we have is someone asked, are waterfowl production areas, the federal ones, are they considered wetlands?
Let's see. I'm gonna make sure.
Yes, I would.
Yes.
Yeah, I would say many of them have wetlands, or probably all of them have wetlands on them, and but also would have some uplands or non-wetland areas as well.
And then Grace, really quick, someone asked what the longest fish on that first slide was. I can't remember what it was, but
The longest fish in the middle of that slide was the short-nosed gar.
Okay, awesome. All right, we'll get the rest of those questions answered as soon as Ted's done.
All right, thanks Grace for leading in, and Grace got to show you all these pretty pictures of the amazing things in wetlands, and then I got to thinking, well, I get to start and talk about wetland loss and threats, and that's kind
I'm
of
sorry.
yeah, it's like, so I got this nice photo that's not very attractive here of a wetland that's been drained, and I'm going to talk about that. I'm going to talk about how we've altered our landscape. Grace was talking about all the benefits that these wetlands provide, but we've altered our landscape a lot, and it's had an effect on our wetlands, and we'll talk a little bit about that. And now this is a shameless way for me to put some pictures up of my grandkids and my granddog. So, but there's actually a purpose for this. I got to thinking, well, how do I make a nicer looking slide than just a drained wetland? But the point of this is actually not just to show the kids, but that we've drained a lot of wetlands and altered our landscape a lot, but you need to understand that we all need to rely on safe and reliable transportation, and we need to have food to eat and things, beverages to drink, and we need warm and safe, comfortable houses and places to live. And so those things are things that we need. So it's easy to judge how we've altered the landscape, and we have, but that was done for certain purposes. And I think the key going forward is how do we have a more sustainable landscape, sustainable wetlands for all those benefits they provide, but at the same time providing food and shelter for and transportation needs for everyone. So wetlands were legitimately an impediment as the land was developed. And so if you were going to put a crop field in like the upper left and had it flooded out, that could be a problem. If you're trying to put a transportation network in, wetlands could be a problem to deal with. Or if you're trying to build homes and businesses, wetlands could be an issue to deal with. Again, I think we have better ways to deal with that now and to develop and farm and put things in more sustainably. But we really altered the landscape. And so all these services that Grace mentioned that wetlands provide have gone away in many places. And so it's reduced our water quality, our groundwater recharge, and especially our fish and wildlife habitat. And like Grace mentioned, 75% of our threatened and endangered species using these wetland areas, well, they're on the endangered list many times because they're using areas that have been highly altered. So this picture just shows direct fill, dumping material into wetlands, putting underground tile lines in that drains the underground water away and drains a wetland. That's what the upper right is. We've really altered many of our streams. We've channelized them and kind of put them in ditches and farmed right up to the edges, and that alters the associated wetlands. And the lower right is actually a drainage tunnel that was put in to drain a rainwater basin wetland that runs through like a mile of hillside just to drain that wetland. So in a lot of work has been put into draining wetlands over the years. This particular image shows the number of wetlands that we had historically, the top number, the number we currently have, and the percent loss rates. And I put in Nebraska and our surrounding states. And so you can actually see, we can proudly claim that Nebraska has more acres of wetland than any of our surrounding states currently. We have almost 2 million acres of wetlands remaining. And our loss rate is only 35%. Say only, that's still a lot, but a lot of that is buffered because of the Sandhills in Nebraska, and I'm going to talk about that in a moment. But a lot of wetlands remaining in the Sandhills, and I'll put this figure in. In a lot of parts in eastern Nebraska, 90% of our wetlands have been destroyed, just like Iowa. I have to admit, I'm from Iowa. Iowa is drained 90% of their wetlands. We've done the same in lots of places in Nebraska, certainly in the eastern parts of the state where we have more people living and more row crop agriculture. And not only have we lost a lot of our wetlands, but they have ongoing threats. So sedimentation coming off those crop fields and urban developments. We've really altered our streams in many ways. We still have some drainage and filling of wetlands. I put as a threat lack of management. And I'll talk about the dynamics of wetlands. They need to be managed in order to be as productive as they historically were. And then we got a lot of different species, both plants and animals, that are invasive. They're not native to Nebraska, or they become a problem due to high nutrient levels and things. And so they're things we deal with now that historically we wouldn't have in our wetlands. And so just to run through a couple of those. So again, we have row crop agriculture coming into and right through a lot of our wetlands in Nebraska. And this is a photo that just shows that sediment after one rain event. That little delta plume there is sediment that's come off of a crop field into a wetland. And so when you have that happening, it fills that wetland in over time and reduces the functions it can provide. I mentioned our wetland invaders, and these are just a few of the plant species we deal with: purple loosestrife, reed canary grass, and hybrid cattail. Trees in some of our wetlands, even though we love trees in many places, trees can be a problem if it's a prairie type of wetland that historically did not have trees. And then we have a species called common reed or Phragmites. This is just a very short list of a few pictures of a long list of invaders that we deal with in our aquatic systems. And so that's something that we have to deal with. And then ongoing threats, I mentioned we've altered our streams, we've put up levees, we've put in dams and put riprap in. We have these ditches. We have streams that are down cutting or getting deeper. And that's what the photo in this lower right shows. You get this erosive gully that comes off of the stream and actually drains out the wetland. And so even though we're not directly filling wetlands in these cases, the wetlands and the functions they provide are being highly altered. Now I'm going to switch and talk about the different, do kind of a quick tour around the state and talk about some of the different wetland types we have in kind of four broad categories. I'll talk about the Sandhills up here in north central Nebraska. I'll talk about our playa wetlands, talk about our riverine wetlands, and then our saline wetlands we have right around Lincoln and Lancaster and Saunders County. We also have some alkali wetlands along the North Platte River out in western Nebraska. And then actually in the western part of the Sandhills, I'll have a picture of this. We have some alkali lakes and wetlands also in that part of the Sandhills. So I'll just show a few pictures of some of the wetland types. We could give a whole webinar just on any of these different wetland areas. The Sandhills are amazing. If you've never been to the Sandhills, it's definitely needs to be something to put on your bucket list. It's 20,000 square miles of intact grassland, mostly private ranch land. Well managed by the ranchers who own that land and manage it. And it's got over 1 million acres of lakes and marshes and meadows and fens and as we mentioned, these unique alkali wetlands that get this salty crust on them out in the western part of the Sandhills. So just an amazing wetland type. This is a photo I took of a Sandhills wetland, kind of the classic with a big thunderhead in the background and a windmill on a ranch. And the Sandhills, very important. Grace talked about all the wildlife that use them. The Sandhills, very important for things like duck production and also shorebird use. So many of our sandpipers, and these are phalaropes and sandpipers of several different species here, use these wetland areas. So Sandhills, very important for that. And this is just showing that ranching economy is very important in the Sandhills. We work closely with the ranchers to sustain this resource. And I have this guy coming in slow because it's a turtle, right? And they go a little bit slower. So this is a Blanding's turtle that live in marshes in the Sandhills. And Blanding's turtles are on the threatened or endangered list in many of our surrounding states. We're actually a stronghold for the Blanding's turtle, mainly because we have all these abundant and healthy wetlands in the Sandhills that support things like Blanding's turtles and lots of other wildlife. I love this photo. Ethan Fries with a Platte Basin time-lapse group took this with a drone. It's on the Sandhills rivers. And so this is in the Sandhills, but a river, and you can see the flowing river channel. And then adjacent to that, you have all of these different wetlands and sandbars and little side channels and things that rivers have. And so this is an example of one of those. This is another one. Certainly we're all familiar, I think, with the Platte River that comes across Nebraska. Again, hopefully on your bucket list is to see the crane migration. We get 80% of the sandhill cranes migrating into the Central Platte. There's a few out there now. They've been hanging out there in this terrible weather. Within the next few weeks, we'll probably get a lot more. And by mid-March, usually, it's quite a spectacle to see. In addition, there's other things like least terns and piping plovers that use the sandbars on the Platte and some of our other rivers for nesting habitat. In addition to the Platte, and I, again, don't have time to get into all the different rivers, but I just show a picture here of the Elkhorn River, the Missouri River, the Niobrara River, all tremendous amounts of wetlands and really unique diversity of wetlands associated with those rivers. And all of the rivers and streams in Nebraska have wetlands associated with them. Playas are a fairly unique type of wetland that form in our heavy clay soil. So they tend to be in these flat areas that are pretty heavily row cropped. This is out in Perkins County, out in the southwestern part of the state. You can see the wetland here. Ethan took this photo as well. Little circular spot that they farm through periodically. Got some cattle grazing a spot and a little wetland back here. These aren't connected to any rivers or streams. They're not connected to groundwater like the Sandhills, I forgot to mention, is connected directly to the Ogallala Aquifer and gets a lot of its water from the groundwater. These wetlands are 100 feet or more above groundwater, so they get their water from rainfall and snowmelt. The rainwater basins are one of the playa type wetlands in south central Nebraska that are internationally recognized as significant, important for waterfowl during their migration. Also shorebirds are a habitat of hemispheric importance for shorebirds and have been declared as such. And then whooping cranes use a lot of our different wetland types, the highly endangered whooping crane, including rainwater basins and the Platte River and Sandhills and Niobrara River as well. We have a lot of other playas. These are some up in Custer County, up near the town of Broken Bow. You can see these are out, these little circular wetlands out in crop fields. There's little canyons nearby. And these attract, again, a lot of shorebirds. We also get whooping cranes on these playas. And you have a lot of different amphibian life in these that amazingly survives even through the cropping and the long drought periods. This is a Great Plains toad that is kind of burrowed down into the mud and able to survive in these very, very harsh environments at times. I should say that shorebird was a stilt sandpiper, by the way, so people who want to know that. It's a species that migrates through Nebraska and nests up in the Arctic, so pretty neat species. The final type of wetland I'll talk about is our saline wetlands, and they occur, the eastern saline wetlands right around Lincoln. They get this salt crust, which is this sodium chloride or table salt that develops. The city of Lincoln was founded as a basically salt mining or salt extraction community. There's a whole different presentation we could give on that. The saline wetlands unique. They have some very unique plants. The Gray showed earlier saltwort. It's one of our endangered species. It's also called pickleweed. You can see it almost looks like little pickles. And then the grass behind it is salt grass that grows in our saline wetlands. And then the Salt Creek tiger beetle, another species, probably one of the most imperiled animals in North America, only found in the salt marshes right around Lincoln. We have populations of probably 300 or less, maybe 400 of the entire species lives right here in the saline wetlands near Lincoln. And finally, I really want to emphasize, even though I kind of show where playas or the Sandhills are, and they're amazing wetlands, we have wetlands everywhere. So wetlands are throughout the state. So anywhere you live in the state, you're going to have wetlands, whether it be out in the Pine Ridge or the Sand Sage or that little flower in the middle is called jewelweed that grows like at Fontenelle Forest and along the eastern fringe of Nebraska, and some little slope wetlands and streams, wetlands associated with all the streams in our urban areas as well. So there are wetlands associated with all of our streams and lakes, and wetlands in every county in the state. And I just like this picture. Grace showed the white-tailed deer earlier. This is a little bigger view of that Ethan took, and amazing photograph of some deer using Salt Creek just right on the north edge of Lincoln, adjacent to a saline wetland. So pretty neat places. So shift now and mention the dynamics of wetlands. I never give a talk without talking about out here on the Great Plains that Nebraska occupies as part of. Wetlands are highly dynamic, and we know, having lived here, the weather's pretty dynamic. It's 20 degrees today, and I thought it was wonderful out. I almost took my coat off because the terrible cold we just had. The weather is always changing. We have droughts and we have floods, and we have all these dynamics, and they play a big role in how these wetlands function and how they can change from day to day and certainly from year to year. And one of the dynamics is, again, this altering of wet and dry cycles. So wetlands dry up, and that's okay. They naturally dry up and they get these cracks forming. Well, the sediment here, the bottom of this wetland's been exposed to sunlight, it's oxygenated. And when all that happens, you actually get plants responding to that. So most wetland plants actually germinate when they get exposed to that sunlight and oxygen, and don't grow underwater, don't germinate underwater. They need one of these dry periods to get reestablished. And so this wet and dry cycle is very important for that. And I love this diagram. Ducks Unlimited originally put this out in their magazine, and it just shows a wetland, hypothetical wetland, across 3 different years and the 4 seasons. And I love how it shows the dynamics of those wetlands, how they can change year to year and also across seasons. And so it's one of the things that's frustrating about wetlands, because if you're trying to teach about them, they're always different. You can't go visit this site and it will look just like this, because it could look very different day to day, certainly season to season and year to year. But that's also a thing that's really neat about the wetlands. They're very dynamic, fascinating places that way. And so in addition to the wet and dry cycles, the floods and droughts, we historically had some grazers on these wetlands. Bison, elk, deer, and pronghorn would graze these wetlands, and that was part of the dynamic on the prairie and the wetlands that are embedded in that prairie. And then we have prairie fire, and again, prairie fire is an important component of prairie. We certainly talk about it with anything when we talk about prairie landscapes in Nebraska. But those wetlands that were embedded in the prairie, undoubtedly, those prairie fires did burn right through those. And so this interaction of burning and grazing was an important component of that. I'm going to show here a time-lapse video Mariah Lundgren shared with me. It's just a 30-second clip. And I think all the talking I've done about dynamics, in 30 seconds, you'll see it better than I could ever explain it. So this is one camera in a place called Mormon Island, right outside of Grand Island, on a property the Crane Trust owns. It's a wet meadow wetland along the Platte River. And I'll run the video, and you'll see in 30 seconds the cattle grazing, which act like the bison used to some degree. You'll see wildlife, you'll see snow, rain events, you'll see it wetting and drying out. You'll see a fire in just this 30 seconds. This is over like a 2-year period. And to me, it really shows that these wetlands are alive. So it shows they're almost like they're breathing, the water coming in and out, the weather changing, the animals using the site. So let me run this, see if we can get it to play here. So that is the exact same spot, the exact same wetland, and just amazing to me how different it is just from moment to moment. So that's one of the things that should bring awe and wonder, and if you're interested in wetlands, that every time you visit them, you could see something different, and just fascinating that way. So appreciate Mariah Lundgren and the Platte Basin Time Lapse Group sharing that. They're doing a project about Follow the Water on the Platte River. They're also doing a project for us, and Grace will mention this at the end, on wetlands in Nebraska. And so more product will be coming from that project, so we can look forward to that. Finally, I'll wrap up here and talk about wetland conservation initiatives. And so we talked about the loss and threats, and so wetlands have had a lot of harm done to them. They've died a death, sometimes of 1,000 cuts, right? They've had many things happen to them that alter their how they function. But the bright side of that is there's lots we're doing to try to conserve wetlands. I'll touch just on a little bit of that. The things that we do are in place. One of those is we do have some regulations that protect wetlands. The federal government, the state government, many local governments have recognized, as Grace shared earlier, the services these wetlands provide, and they're protected under the Federal Clean Water Act, under the swamp buster provisions of the federal farm bill that farmers or end up complying with or having to deal with. And the state of Nebraska recognizes wetlands as waters of the state, and understands that they provide certain beneficial uses that need to be protected. So we have a regulatory layer that helps protect some of our wetlands that are remaining. But that in and of itself is not enough. We have to take some proactive measures to protect wetlands. We work with a lot of different agencies and organizations that help acquire wetlands, that put easements in place, conservation easements that can help secure wetlands and still allow private land use. And so a lot of different initiatives that way on wetland protection. In addition, we recognize Nebraska as a private land state. Over 90%, 95%, of the lands are privately owned. And so if we're going to do effective wetland conservation, we have to work well with landowners. And so we have programs to work with farmers, ranchers, acreage owners. And that's really important, because we have to be able to work with them. They can own the land. They have the say in what goes on with that land. We have to figure out how can we work wetlands into their operation in a way that provides the benefits wetlands provide, and also serves their needs as well. We do a lot of restoration work. Again, this is a photo of a project wetland being restored in the rainwater basin. I show this slide because when people drive by, or even when I look at this, you're like, oh, what are we doing out there? It looks like we're destroying a wetland. We have this big yellow machinery and we're moving dirt around. We're actually trying to remove some of the sediment that has worked into this wetland. And so we're trying to do the right thing for the wetland. And I really want to emphasize that to do that, we work with a lot of people with expertise. So my background's in wildlife biology, but I work a lot with people, engineers, hydrologists, soil scientists, botanists, GIS specialists, work with people that have, and landowners who know their property, and they have expertise that we have to rely on and in order to deliver effectively wetland conservation. And finally, management. We talked about how dynamic these systems are. So we have to manage those. And sometimes it takes extreme measures: fire, grazing with livestock, disking, spraying of invasive species, cutting trees if trees were not a natural part of that landscape. So we implement a lot of management measures that have to be implemented even after you restore a site to keep it a wetland. And finally, we'll wrap up, just touch on, I don't want to convey that all this is stuff that I do by any means, or even stuff that Game and Parks does, because we work across the state in a number of partnerships, and we work closely with these partnerships. And some of the ones I work with closely are in these little yellow boxes. They are, this is a map showing these wetland complexes across Nebraska. And the green ones are actually wetland areas within our biologically unique landscapes under our natural legacy plan that we operate in. So the natural legacy plan, providing that blueprint for conservation of Nebraska for our biodiversity. And so wetlands are an important component of that. And I'll just highlight three before I hand it back to Grace here. And that's And I could mention many more, and there's so many different partners that we could mention: government agencies, organizations, nonprofit conservation groups, landowners that we work with. But there's a theme in these three, and it's people coming together to work on a common landscape to address a certain wildlife need or wetland type, in this case, the rainwater basin, dealing with migratory waterfowl and shorebirds and other things as well, and then having a plan that helps to address that. So whether it be in the rainwater basin that's dominated with row crop agriculture, the Sandhills that are a ranching landscape where we serve on a board there of the Sandhills Task Force that works with ranchers on that landscape. And then a very different landscape, the saline wetlands. There's a saline wetland conservation partnership working in and around Lincoln with partners to try to deliver and bring wetland conservation into those places. And with that, I close with really saying, and this hands it off to Grace as well, that there's a lot of science needs, and she'll touch on science as well, but these are complicated systems across the state. There's a lot we don't understand. So there's a lot that we can continue to learn from all of you on how these wetlands work and how to do better in the future on conserving them. And that's my portion. So Grace will finish it up for us here. You're muted, Grace.
Grace, we do have a few questions. We'll go ahead and just hold those. I want to make sure that you get to the rest of your presentation, and then we can do the rest of the questions at the end. So Grace, if you want to go ahead.
You are, Grace, you're muted.
Thank you. All right. Perfect. Okay. Yeah. So that leads me into the science that's necessary for us to understand these really cool wetlands, and telling all of you that, you actually have ways that you can contribute to this work that's actually done in wetlands as well. So if you haven't heard, you might have heard it called citizen science, and it's kind of changing to be called community science. And so there's lots of different projects that go on in wetlands. I believe there's one called Frog Watch, where you can kind of go out and you try to find these different types of frogs and note that they are there. And that helps scientists, because then they have that data to tell them, okay, yes, this species is present here. And oftentimes scientists are participating, like professional scientists are participating in these events too. So then it's cool because you get to kind of meet together. Obviously COVID has kind of affected this, but I think that that will continue once we get through this. And I do think that this offers great opportunities for, those different groups of people to come together and learn about these wetlands together. And it's just some other accessible things for any person that you can use if you have a cell phone is actually an app called iNaturalist. It's pretty accurate as far as I can tell when I use it. Mushrooms are a little hard for the app, but I do think it's a great app because you can take photos of things you see in the wetland, upload it through this app, and then it can actually tell you, what you're looking at. Oftentimes it shows you a range of options of what you could be seeing. And then once, if you're not sure, you can still guess what you think it is, and then actual more experts in the field will go in and approve your identification. If it's or if it's wrong, they'll change it to the correct identification, and then actually that research becomes research grade, so that scientists maybe doing a project in that area can look at the iNaturalist app and see, oh my gosh, this person saw Salt Creek tiger beetle right here, and we didn't think they were there. So there's kind of some cool things that could happen when you start using these. So you might be out there on the right day and see something that scientists didn't know, or that they would help expand their knowledge. So another app similar to this is called eBird, and this is obviously bird specific, but so many different birds you can see in wetlands. So that's a really fun activity to just kind of get out there, and you can also contribute to scientific data, which is awesome.
Hey,
and then back to recreation.
Sorry, Grace, can you switch to the big presenter mode? We're seeing like the next slide in your notes and stuff.
Yes, maybe. Display settings. How about that?
Perfect.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, so then kind of this falls back into recreation and wetlands and things that you can do there. And so that's a way that you can participate in wetlands, get connected to them, understand them better, and appreciate them. And I think when we start to build that sort of community that appreciates these resources, there's just a better chance for that conservation work to continue and for us to continue to preserve these awesome spaces. And so one of these is, canoeing or kayaking is a great one. If you have any that I don't mention, please put them in the chat, because I probably just scratched the surface of what there is to do. But this was actually when I worked at Fontenelle Forest, I would lead canoeing programs, and we would do this at sunrise, and it was really amazing experience. So that's what this photo is. And then there's obviously fishing that you can do. Hunting is a big activity, especially like Ted was kind of talking about, those waterfowl areas in the Playa and Rainwater Basin. This is a picture from also when I was I did camp at Fontenelle Forest in that river. That was a riverine wetland. Super fun. You can explore them and just get in there, and you will learn so much just from, obviously getting muddy or really becoming part of that landscape and getting to experience it fully. So I feel like that's what those kids are definitely doing there. And yeah, just when you're hiking, there's so many cool things that you can see. And like Ted said, every time you go, it's going to be a different experience. One time you might see an owl, another time you might, see tracks, and there's just so much endless opportunities there. And I have that sun and the moon on there because I do feel like getting into a wetland at sunrise or kind of at night when the moon is full, like those are really unique experiences that I feel like have impacted me. And I do feel like they're awesome things for you to go explore. And the nice thing is, like Ted was saying, wetlands are all over. So you can have those experiences right near to where you live, which is cool. And then keeping in mind, of course, I just had to put this in there, recreating responsibly. So the leave no trace principles are really good to keep in mind too, because we can use these resources and it's amazing that we can. And we also have to remember to respect the space, because if we don't, then we are causing issues in the wetland as well. So, planning ahead is really helpful. Wetlands, we talked about this in our last presentation, wetlands have mosquitoes usually. So knowing what to expect when you go, and, bringing the maybe couple things you need, whether that's sunscreen or bug spray, some of those things you might want to make sure you think ahead. But then, making sure you're disposing of any waste properly, leaving behind what you find. So, if you find a really cool feather, it's kind of better to leave it so someone else can find it when they go back. And then, respecting wildlife and the other people that are visiting that wetland as well is just important things to keep in mind when you are out there recreating in wetlands. And so with this, also another cool thing that has to do with wetlands is a project that Ted and I are working on with these other organizations that are listed on here. So Ducks Unlimited, the Nebraska Cooperative Fish and Wildlife Research Unit, and then especially that Platte Basin time-lapse team. So we're trying to bring together the media, the video, the images, and all of the cool information about wetlands to create this Wetlands of Nebraska Outreach and Education Project. So there is stuff that has already been created for this, and it's at nebraskawetlands.com. And so our current project is to update materials. So Ted, I don't know if you want to add anything to that.
If people go to that site, there's a little bit on there. There's a video trailer that was just put out by Platte Basin Time Lapse, like a 2-minute little teaser trailer about some of the product they're collecting. And then like Grace is working on a publication, I'm working on a publication. A whole bunch of audio visual materials will be coming available within the next year. A lot of that will be released probably sometime in 2022. So stay tuned. Maybe we'll need to do another webinar then and share some of those materials. So
I think even in May is American Wetlands Month. And so watch for that, because I think there will be various presentations, and I hope that one of them can talk about our process and where we are so far with this project, because I think there are some really cool stories associated with, our producers who are catching this film and such like that. So I think it will be cool.
And you're
Grace, is
talking
that
May
something
of
that you could put in the chat?
2021.
So if people wanted to watch that trailer, that you could probably put that in there for them?
Yes.
Yeah, if
I
you go
will.
to-
Or Ted?
I
Yeah,
have it up actually just in case we had time, so I'll put it in the chat here. if
yeah,
I can-
people can just go to it and take a peek, and there's more to come.
Yes. Hold on 1 second. I'll paste that in there. All right.
Yep.
Yep. And so then with that, we will open it up for any questions that you might have from this presentation.
Yeah, Grace, we had one, and Ted, a while ago. If you have seen the news or anything, there was this huge shopping center announced yesterday, kind of out by the North 27th Street in North Star High School. How will that significantly, or will it significantly affect the surrounding wetlands?
Want me to take that one?
Yeah, sure, Ted.
Yeah.
You probably have more knowledge on that than I do.
Yeah, I've not seen the exact footprint, exactly where that's going to go. Generally, there's been a lot of development up North 27th Street. Most of that has avoided wetlands. I mentioned in my part that there are some laws that protect those wetland areas. The city of Lincoln's done a great job of having some zoning and building requirements to try to avoid and minimize impacts to wetlands. So I think that they'll do their best to avoid things or have to deal with the regulatory process. That said, the uplands and landscape around wetlands is also important. That's also often less controlled. So it would just depend on the exact site, and I'll have to learn more about that.
Some of our other people that are on have kind of answered this, but I'm kind of interested to see what Ted has to say as well. As far as if we remove wetlands, does that mean that flooding is more probable? I know someone had answered that kind of in the chat already, but I thought it was a good question to bring up to everybody in case you didn't see it.
Yeah, studies have shown that what happens when you remove wetlands is that water that would have been stored in the wetland now isn't going to be stored there. Like Grace mentioned, they're like a sponge, they can hold some water. That varies. If they're all full of water, like 2 years ago, that huge flood we had, I don't know that a lot of wetlands would have kept that. That was a once in a lifetime event, that they would have prevented that. But there are a lot of studies that have shown that if you have a lot of wetlands in a watershed, like an area that a stream or river is getting its water from, that the absolute peak, the highest the floodwaters are going to get, are going to be less, and that and that's the main factor, I guess, because that's where the damage can happen. So it dampens that flood curve, it flattens it out a little bit, and that can keep damage from happening. So yeah, the wetlands and their associated floodplains on the rivers, the more we can have those hold floodwaters, the better.
Someone else also mentioned or asked, you mentioned wetlands in our backyards, but is there a map of major wetland education complexes that are typically visited by the public?
That is a good question. I think we are talking about making maybe a map that is much more detailed in regards to that for our outreach and education project. I think there, at least for Lincoln area, there is the city of Lincoln actually does have a decent map. You can, if you just search like Lincoln wetlands, you should be able to find it pretty easily. But yeah, it tells you kind of if it has a bird blind or like a little overlook spot, parking lot. Ted, you can elaborate if you want.
Yeah, well, I would just say for the rest of Nebraska, if you go to that web link that Grace put in the chat where that video trailer is at, you can scroll down on that page. That's our wetlands page that we keep at Game and Parks. And there's a wetland guide, Guide to Nebraska's Wetlands, it's called. If you click on that and go to, say, Rainwater Basin or Sandhills or Central Platte River, there's a little descriptor that said places to visit. And it describes some places and gives you some general directions from the nearest town. And that list was put together with keeping in mind what is a nice place to visit that's accessible. Even though that document was put out 15 years ago, I think most of those sites, all of them probably, are still still there and for people to see and visit. So that's also a good place. And like Grace mentioned, we're going to try to make an interactive map to make that easier to use in this project we're working on. So stay tuned on that.
And then someone wanted to know, they don't need a full list, but are there any like really cool places that you guys would say maybe in eastern Nebraska where there's a trail list of they could go kind of walk through wetlands or by wetlands, anything that you guys really stands out that you would like to mention in eastern Nebraska?
Ted, you can go ahead if you have one in mind.
Well, like Grace mentioned, the saline wetlands, some of those have some trails, excuse me, and parking areas. There are certainly some areas around Omaha, Heron Haven, and
You can even, yeah.
Fontenelle Forest. Fontenelle Forest, you'd have to be a member.
Or you can pay the daily admission.
Okay, yeah, and pay a daily admission. They have some amazing trails. They have a wetland unit down there along the Missouri River with some neat wetlands. DeSoto Bend National Wildlife Refuge has some great interpretive options as well.
Even if you walk around like Zorinsky or Standing Bear now has a like floating trail in the middle. I mean, those are kind of more of lakes, but they do have wetland edges and stuff. So there's a lot of cool wetland type areas around Omaha.
Someone asked, does the NRD do anything with like stream stabilization and dam work? Does anyone know?
Yeah, we work, there's 23 NRDs in Nebraska. They vary greatly across the state. We work with some of the ones locally here. The Lower Platte South Natural Resources District is part of the Saline Partnership. So they're helping to conserve saline wetlands, but they also have flood control responsibilities in their area. And so they do stream work and flood control projects and the like. I've worked with NRDs across the state. So yeah, they're one of the partners we work with.
Looks like we have one more question. I have one more slide that I just want to say for everybody. I think I'm going. I do. Okay. But thanks everyone for joining us. If you guys want to stick around for questions, I'm sure Ted and Grace would do that. Thanks for joining us. And I do have another set of Science of series coming starting May 13th. We're going to talk about butterflies and moths on May 13th, and then we'll end, I think, June 24th. So it's a 7-week one again. But if you are interested in finding more information about some of the stuff we talked about, I have a slide. You can find our Nebraska Wildlife Education page. Grace, if you can move forward. I can't do it, sorry.
Oh, sorry.
Maybe it should be on.
I think that's the last one.
Okay, maybe it didn't get on yours. So, okay. But I do have, if you want to check out like our YouTube page, our education YouTube channel as well, just Nebraska Nebraska Game and Parks Education YouTube channel. We also have a wildlife education Facebook page. We have a wildlife education Instagram, and then you can also just check out outdoornebraska.gov/wildlife education. So we have a lot of cool resources and things like that to check out. But again, remind you guys to coming back on May 13th, talking about butterflies and moths. So it looks like we did have one more question come in. Ted or Grace, does anyone know what additional programs are available to provide incentive to landowners to protect or avoid removing wetlands?
Sure. I work closely with a lot of our different programs. I thought Trent Findley answered one of those, who's one of our farm bill biologists with Pheasants Forever. But what I would encourage people to do is just reach out to their district Nebraska Game and Parks office and visit with us. And we can tailor a program to about any need. And so instead of getting into all the specifics, just know that whether it's a farmer, rancher, acreage owner, we usually have a program or can customize a program to try to address those needs if they're going to benefit the wetlands and the wildlife. So just lots of different options. And people can reach out to me as well. If you go to that nebraskawetlands.com, my email's listed there. Send me an email and I can get you in touch with the appropriate people wherever you might be in Nebraska. So.
Ted, is it okay if I put your email in the chat for people if they have any questions, or Grace too? Okay. Awesome. Well, if no one else has any other questions, I think we'll go ahead and let people go. It's about an hour exactly, actually. So great timing, both of you, everyone. So, but yeah, if anyone has any other questions, you can certainly email Grace or Ted. I put both of their emails in the chat. I could have certainly done this program, but it would not have been as good as these two. They are truly wetland experts. So thank you both, Grace and Ted, for joining us today. I really appreciate your insight and your really good cool pictures that you guys have too, because I couldn't have found those cool pictures. So
yeah, a lot of people help with the pictures. So
Yep.
yeah, both Nebraska land photos. I did forget to credit that. A lot of our Nebraska land photographers do amazing work, and then we use a Platte Basin time lapse and a few of mine, but mine were the fuzzy ones. So
They're still good.
They're still good. Exactly. Yes. All right. Well, we'll go ahead and leave everyone. Thank you guys again for joining us today, and we will hopefully see you back in May.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Ted. Thanks, Grace.
yeah, bye.